Welcome to the WCAPS 5 podcast series. WCAPS is an online community dedicated to strengthening the leadership and professional development of women of color, specializing in the fields of peace, security, conflict transformation, and foreign policy. Join us as we unpack their valuable perspectives, learn from their strategies, and grow together. VIVE: Vision, Impact, Voice, Engagement.
Hello, welcome. This is Bonnie Jenkins. I'm the founder and executive director of WCAPS, Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. And it's really my honor to bring you all to another webcast that we have here, to our VIVE podcast, Vision, Impact, Voice, Engagement. And as we have with the other podcasts that we've done, we have another really amazing woman who's going to talk a little bit about what she does right now and how she got to where she is now, some of the transitions that she's gone through in terms of particularly going from government into the private sector. And also, we're welcoming her as a new board member of the organization. So her name is Rhee, and she currently lives in New York. And I'm not going to give too much more about her because I want her to do that. So welcome, Jane. It's really, really an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. And I'm really happy to join the board too.
Excellent, excellent. It's really going to be great having you with us. So why don't we start, Jane, by talking a little bit about just who you are and where you came from and just where you are now exactly.
Sure. So I'll start closer to the beginning. I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, but my family actually spent my early childhood in South Korea, which is where my family is from. And then when we came back to the U.S., I was about 5, and then I grew up mostly in Tucson, Arizona, which is about an hour north of the border with Mexico. And I lived there until I was 18. I went off to college and grad school on the East Coast, and I ended up, through a stroke of luck, I would say, my sophomore year of college, I found something called the Pickering Fellowship, and the full name is the Thomas R. Pickering Fellowship, and it allowed me to go on to grad school, which is not something I'd previously considered at the time, and then to join the Foreign Service. And I was in the Foreign Service for 11 years until 2017. Did a number of posts overseas, but also back in DC. And then in 2017, I made the transition to the private sector. And so where I am today is at the Estee Lauder Companies, and I'm the executive director for global public affairs.
Thanks. And why don't we step back a bit and talk about your interest in the field of international relations and foreign policy. Sure. And you mentioned, of course, that you were part of the Pickering Fellowship. How did that happen? I mean, what made you interested in it when you heard about the Pickering Fellowship?
Sure. So, even back in middle school and high school, I think I was always interested in being, in student council or student body government. And it was just an interest I had. And part of, I think, the international angle came from the fact that, I lived overseas when I was younger. And so I always was interested in working, globally. When I went to college, I decided early on that I was going to major in government and political science. And it's funny, I was reflecting on some of these questions today, and it's weird, we're speaking on 9/11, and I was a sophomore, and I was, on my way to registration the day that 9/11 happened. And that was my sophomore year, and it was actually what, it had a big impact on me and many others, but for me, it made me really want to do public service. And so throughout the rest of that year, I started looking into various opportunities to serve. And one of the ones I came across was on the State Department website, and that's how I found the Pickering Fellowship, actually. And so it was later that sophomore year that I ended up applying for and then ultimately getting the fellowship.
And that's great. And tell us a little bit about the fellowship itself and some of the things you did. It might be interesting to some of our listeners who may have an interest in doing the fellowship.
Definitely. It's a fantastic program. It has been in place since the 90s, and it's changed and grown in different ways over the years. But when I applied for it, it was in the spring of 2002. You can apply for it in one of two stages, either as an undergraduate or as you are applying and looking into going to graduate school. So as an undergraduate, I applied. It's funded by the State Department. Sometimes I describe it as kind of a State Department version of ROTC, because it does come with some requirements and training, if you will, to take certain classes, to take language, and it provides the funding for you to go on to graduate school. And so you get a master's in, mine was in public affairs, or you can, some related field like that. And then afterward, you join the Foreign Service, and you have a requirement of a certain number of years, depending on whether you come in as an undergraduate or whether you come in as a graduate fellow. And so for an undergraduate fellow, at the time, it was 4.5 years. To get in and to get started in the training for Foreign Service, you do have to pass the test. You still have to do the requirements and demonstrate your fitness for the job, and then once you're in, and you fulfill your requirements, and you can obviously stay on. I stayed on well past my required time, and then others leave and go on to do other things, but it's a relatively small cohort each year, but they are looking for people from diverse backgrounds, and that's one of the, I think, real strengths of the program, is that it's across a lot of different categories: gender, ethnicity, race, religion, geography. They're looking for different kinds of people to show what America really looks like and who we are, especially when we represent the United States overseas.
So tell us a little bit about when you started working in the Foreign Service. What were some of the places that you went to, and describe the experience for yourself, those years that you were doing it.
Sure. I'd say every Foreign Service officer's career path is different and unique. And so everyone starts in training, what we call A100, and you get the basics of doing things like writing a cable, understanding the State Department's organizational structure, meeting with various senior leaders who come and speak to the classes. But the most memorable day is when you get your first assignment. And so my first assignment was actually to Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. And you've listed, prior to getting your assignment, you list, your preference for different postings, and you look at things like the kind of training you would get when you go out to post, how long that tour is. It's usually 2 years, but sometimes if it's a more dangerous place, it can be 1 year. You look at the kind of responsibilities that you would be doing at that position, and you look at the language requirements. And so for this particular position that I got, it was a Farsi designated position. And so I spent, the first year of my career actually at the Foreign Service Institute, taking consular training, which everyone has to do at some point early in their careers, and also learning Farsi for 9 months. And then you have to test and show that you have learned the language to a certain degree, and then you are shipped out to post. And so I did consular work in Dubai for 2 years. That was interviewing people for visas who wanted to come to the United States. That was helping American citizens who needed various services or were in distress in those countries, and making sure that they were receiving fair treatment, or that they could communicate with people or get legal assistance, things like that. That is kind of the bread and butter of every junior Foreign Service officer's career. And then once you get past that requirement, you start to go into different positions based on what your, what we call cone is. So there are 5 cones: political, economic, public diplomacy, management, and consular. I was a political officer. That took me back to the State Department at some point to work in our operations center, which is 24 hours. So I was getting up at weird hours of the night to come to work sometimes. I went to Kabul, Afghanistan, where I worked in the ambassador's office, and worked with a lot of high-level visitors and delegations that came through, and taking them to meetings with Afghan government officials, or taking them out to various military bases around the country. And then after that, I came back, and this is where my Farsi language sort of kicked back in. Having done that when I was in Dubai, I had some familiarity with kind of our interactions with Iranians, because we have an Iran regional presence office out in Dubai. And so I ended up getting an offer to go work on the Iran desk. And then I actually spent a fair chunk of time for the rest of my time in government working on Iran at the State Department and also at the National Security Council when we were doing the Iran nuclear negotiations. And then came back to the State Department for a bit, doing economic issues, then went back to the National Security Council for my last year plus in government, where I actually worked in an office called Strategic Planning. And that's where I kind of shifted focus, and they were doing a great project on kind of bigger workforce issues, and specifically around talent and diversity. And in part because, you know, I have a strong interest in it, having been a Pickering Fellow and just kind of observed various issues over the years. I worked on a presidential memorandum to promote diversity and inclusion in national security that came out in late 2016. And then after that, I felt it was time for me to make a transition, and that's when I made the move to New York. Sorry, that was really long.
No, that's great. Thank you. And what would you say? I mean, now that you've been out of the Foreign Service for 3 years or so, or 2 years or so, what would you say is what do you feel was the most enriching thing that you've done during those years? What do you, when you look back at that, what do you think about in terms of what you learned and how it enriched you as a person?
When I look back, I think anyone who leaves government, I think, has a sense, that their time serving and doing public service was one of the high points of their careers, and I certainly feel the same. Just being able to represent the United States is obviously a big privilege, no matter how old you are or wherever you are in your career, whether you come in later or not. So I always feel like that was an amazing honor that I got to have early in my career, and one that I'll never forget. I worked with incredibly smart people, some of the best strategic thinkers, I think, that will be recorded, as history records what happens in these years. I've had the privilege to see them in action, and I feel really fortunate that I got to see how that worked. And see how policy was actually made. Working on a priority like Iran really allowed me the opportunity to see, when a government or administration has a priority that they believe is in the national interest, like how does it actually work? Who comes to the table? What are the decisions that have to be made? What are the what are high level negotiations? What do they look like? What does that entail? I got to see all of that kind of behind the scenes, and that's one of the best memories I have.
Yes, I totally agree with you on that. And actually, I'm teaching a course now at Georgetown, and even though the focus of the course, the topic is not how U.S. foreign policy is made, though
Mhm.
it focuses on the topic of U.S. foreign policy. That obviously that issue of how it's made obviously comes up a lot, and I really enjoy talking about that part because
Mhm.
you really do get a unique perspective when you're actually working on these issues on a regular basis. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Um, why don't you say a little bit about the work that you did on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Because I know that we had a chat about that
Mhm.
a couple of years ago. And so maybe you could say a little bit for the audience about what you did on that and how that came about.
Sure. So I had gone back to the State Department after 2 years working on Iran, and starting to move on to other positions and tours as the Foreign Service makes you do, which is a good thing. In general, it makes you a generalist and kind of able to be adaptable and flexible. But an opportunity came up to come back and work in this office where it was not surprisingly, I think, it was a priority for that administration to be inclusive in many ways. But the part that, from the National Security Council perspective, we could contribute to that conversation by looking at, what does diversity look like in the national security community? It was the, belief of that administration that diversity is one of our greatest strengths as a country. And so if it's one of our greatest strengths, how do we make sure we leverage it and maximize that opportunity that we have in the national security space, which is critical, for the issues that we work on and the challenges that we face day in and day out. It is the last place on earth that you want to have something like groupthink, or that you want to be excluding people and not bringing in the right talent for reasons that have to do with diversity or bias, or wanting to be exclusive. And so we took a careful look, and we brought a bunch of different agencies together who work in the national security community, and said, what are some of the initiatives, what are some of the unique challenges? Because there are some unique challenges in the national security agencies that don't exist in some other agencies, like security clearances, like dealing with classified information. So having to, physically be present in an office a lot of times instead of having flexibility to work elsewhere or have different hours. And so what are some of the unique challenges? What are some of the interesting initiatives that other agencies have done, and we can share best practices? What is, what can we do better? What is the data that shows, where we are? And how can we put more opportunities and processes in place to, promote diversity and inclusion rather than, keeping bias in either, whether it's in the hiring process or in the policymaking process. So it was a fantastic project. I'm really glad I had the opportunity to work on it.
Yes, and I've had a chance to read the document, and it's really a great document, and the things that it asked the agencies and departments to do. What do you think about, has that challenge, or how do you think that challenge has changed or not changed? I know you're not in the national security government structure anymore, but from your perspective, I wonder if you have any thoughts on where we are now with that issue.
Yeah, so I'm not in those agencies or any of the in government agencies anymore. I would say, I think it's been well documented that, State Department in particular, and maybe other agencies, there's been an exodus of experience at the higher levels. And now increasingly also, we're hearing a bit more, I think, at the mid-level as well. There's no, I think, hard data that would break down, whether it's disproportionately affecting certain groups more than others. But I think in general, it is, I think, it's not, I think there's definitely been some morale issues. And so it can be in some, it's obviously a challenge now. I would say it can also be an opportunity, perhaps, in the next couple of years. to see where things are and try to, make changes. I do understand, I've heard that, for example, something we had recommended in the memorandum, and I believe is being carried out, is, the unconscious bias training, or we had, requested certain changes to the security clearance or process to try and make it less onerous for people who are the ones who will have more foreign contacts overseas. So people who may be coming from immigrant families or are children of immigrants, things like that. I do understand there are some of those things happening. There is still data being published by some of the agencies, which is helpful for accountability purposes. But certainly I think it's documented that there have been some exits, but I don't know. I don't have the hard data on how much that's affected different groups more than others.
Right. And before we talk a little bit more about your transition from government to private sector, how many women and women of color did you work with? Just, I mean, I know you don't have to count exact numbers, but when you were working in government, I mean, do you feel like at that time there was I mean, we know it's not great, so we're not going to say it was good. But, I mean, were you very often the only woman or woman of color in your time at state?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably not unlike other people, it got better over time for me. I think when I was younger and when first starting out, and I think at different posts, depending on how big or small they are, you can feel often like you might be the only woman or person of color in the room. And it varied by bureau as well. So depending on which geography or geographic region you were focused on, I think that also varied. I think by the time I finished, though, I would say, when I was at the National Security Council near the end, the top leadership, I think 4 out of 5 of the top folks were women, obviously led by Susan Rice. And I was seeing a lot more, at least, and this was, I think, backed up by the State Department data, at least, where there was a lot more gender diversity in the leadership positions. I think it got to around 40%, but much less so when it came to other types of diversity. And I think that was my experience as well. If you're paying attention to it, I think you could see, like you would see a lot more women in positions of power, which was fantastic. And I think it's so important, the representation that you see throughout your career. But on other categories, race, ethnicity, religion also, those are the ones obviously that are reported, things that are not reported, like sexual orientation and things like that, unless someone chose to disclose that information, you wouldn't know. But I think in other types of diversity, there was definitely much less of that across, I think, the entire national security community.
And I guess one more question before we transition. What would you tell young women who want to get into the field of foreign service and they don't necessarily know the best way to do it? What advice would you give them?
Sure. I mean, I was lucky that I had kind of a formal pathway through the Pickering Fellowship. There are other opportunities, as like there's the Charles Rangel Fellowship that's very similar to the Pickering. There's the Payne Fellowship with USAID. There are other opportunities like that. There's obviously the Presidential Management Fellow Program that you can apply after grad school. There were pathways that we looked at when I was working on the diversity project, because it was also about young people. It's dropped from, I think, in the 20 or 30% to, I think, in the single digits of young people coming into government as kind of their first career choice after school. And I think we're missing out because we have less young people who can, inject new skills and perspectives in the work that we do. So it's definitely, there is a gap. There's obviously, for the Foreign Service in particular, there is the test that you can take, and that is open to anyone. I think within a certain age range, you don't need a high school, you don't need a college degree. You can take the test and take it more than once. So there is, for the Foreign Service at least, a more formal way you can enter. For other kind of jobs and positions more broadly in the peace and security space or in the national security field, I think, one of the things that I actually really love is in terms of the diversity of experience and skills that people bring. We need them. We need people with science backgrounds. We need people who have program management backgrounds or data analytical backgrounds. We need all sorts of people in national security. And so I would, look into what your skill set is and whether you can find a match. And I'm pretty sure you would be able to find it somewhere in one of the government agencies that work on national security or foreign policy, or in a great NGO or any of these organizations. They have a use for someone like you. And the question is, how do you want to spend your day? Do you want to spend it in the field? Do you want to spend it back in DC working, doing the policy making process? Do you want to do research? There's so many different kinds of jobs, and part of your job is to figure out, what would make you passionate and want to come to work every day, and think about, how you want to spend your day doing it. But I'm pretty sure there's a job for that in the national security space.
Great. Okay, so let's transition now, or talk about your transition. So when it was there, so there obviously came a point when you realized, okay, I need to do something different, and you decided that you would go to New York, and you would work in a private sector. Talk a little bit about that decision and how and what led you to that and how that was made.
Sure. So, I hope it's come across by now how grateful I am for the time I spent in the Foreign Service, at the State Department, and in government in general. And then there came a point where, I had worked now at that point with enough leaders and, political appointees who came in and came out of government. And I really admired the ones who had a diversity of experience in and out of government, who could bring in different perspectives over time, who had different skills, different management styles, all sorts of things that I thought, I would like to have that kind of experience as well. I think, I want to put myself in a new position. I want to challenge myself in that way and see, what does it look like from the private sector side when you see these policies coming out of the federal government or the state government? What does it mean to work in a global company and have, a footprint that is not about embassies and consulates, but about, manufacturing factories or retail stores, or, what are your concerns? What are your interests? What does it mean? Because, one of the, I think, coming in, I came in 2006, the recession happened in, 2007, 2008. And it really, I think, drove home when I was both overseas in a place like Dubai, which had been growing tremendously before the recession, and then when I was back in DC as well, about how important the US economy was to our foreign policy, actually. I learned that even further, working on sanctions issues, understanding the role of companies and how economic decisions were made and business decisions were made. And so I was really just curious to see what that world would be like. And so I had an opportunity to connect with someone here at the Estee Lauder companies who had also previously served in government and was starting a new public affairs team for the company. And so it was an interesting and great opportunity to kind of come in on the ground for the team, at least. The company's been around since 1946. So, you have kind of the cushion of having institutional support and growth. But as a team, it was relatively small and new and exciting. And so it was just a really great opportunity to join a company that I knew about and I really respected. It was, started by Estee Lauder in the 1940s and, a strong female entrepreneur. And so I took the chance to join the company.
So how has it been? How has it been working in private sector and living in New York?
So I think I heard from another podcast that you're from Brooklyn.
I'm from the Bronx.
Yeah, you're from the Bronx. So I now live in Brooklyn and work in Manhattan. And, it's always one of those places I wanted to try and live. It was, for all the really exciting international places in the world, New York is right up there as just an amazing city with things to offer that no other place can. And so I'm really glad to have had the chance to live here. I've been here now 2+ years. So that was part of the draw. Was coming to a great place like this. The transition and working here has been great. I think I can obviously, there's a lot about the company itself that I really enjoy. I think this year it was named by Forbes as the top employer for women in the United States, which was really awesome.
Yeah.
But in general, I think this goes whether you work, at a global organization like this or a small business or wherever you work. I think really the main thing that you want to look for and that makes a huge impact on your day-to-day happiness is your team, and the culture, and do you work well together. And I'm really lucky. I have a great team here. I have a fantastic boss. I have a great support structure here that have really welcomed me with open arms. And so, for that reason alone, it's been a really great transition.
So what does the future hold for you, Jane?
That is a great question. I don't know. Obviously I'm very happy here. I still have a lot to learn, so I'm looking forward to that. Our team is growing, and I get to work on my key focus here is on emerging markets, which is always an area I've really enjoyed, and so I look forward to doing more of that. And then also staying engaged with people like you, being on the board of WCAPS and other organizations that I feel passionately about and do really great work on issues that are close to my interests, whether it's on diversity and inclusion, or in foreign policy. Like I said, I met some of the smartest and best people when I was in DC or when I was overseas. I still keep in touch with a lot of them. Some of my best friends are still in that space, and so hopefully I'll continue to do that as well. It's kind of nice actually having a foot in both worlds. And New York is my home now, but DC is also, I go back there often. And I think things like this, like things like WCAPS, didn't exist when I was in government. And so I really love to see kind of the evolution of how people in and out of government are evolving in space like pushing for greater diversity, or thinking of different initiatives and efforts in foreign policy. I think it's really exciting.
Great. And do you get back to Atlanta at all?
I don't. I was born there, and then we moved relatively quickly after I was born. And so I've not had a chance really to go back and spend a significant amount of time. But when I talk to people who know the place or grew up there, and I tell them where I was born, and like I feel like it's the Southern hospitality, even though I can't really claim it, but and I don't deserve it, but it's really nice. I do enjoy being able to say I was born there.
Great. Do you have any family there at all at this point?
No, my family has kind of moved even since I'm the youngest of three, and after I left for college. My parents also started moving around, and my brothers have also moved around. So we're now in pretty different places than where we were in terms of where we grew up, all of us. But it's nice where most of us are on the East Coast. So now at least I get to see them on a pretty regular basis. And I get to visit new places like California and, places like that. So it's nice. But yeah, it's kind of wish my family was all closer together.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jane. This has been great. I don't know if there's any final words you'd like to say, to young people, or just a final thought on, your career or where we are at foreign policy or DEI. I mean, anything you'd like to kind of say as a final word before we end the podcast.
I think the last thing I really am excited about WCAPS. Like, I'm so grateful to you and others who have started this group, because I think it's an important kind of group of people who were not recognized in this way before. And there's a lot of exciting things happening, I think, and the connections that you are facilitating, and the spotlight you're putting on young ambassadors, things like that, I think will be critical for making diversity and inclusion a bigger priority for those of us who are working in this space. So really a thanks to you and everyone else who's made this organization a reality.
Well, thanks, and thanks to you for being a part of it. We're looking forward to working with you as well. So thanks for doing this podcast. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to Jane and some of her, really amazing things that she has done in her career. And we're always anxious to hear where our podcast guests are heading in the future, and staying tuned with their careers, because they've all done such amazing things. So thanks for listening, and continue to follow WCAPS, our podcasts, as well as the activities that we talk about and report on our online sources. We have a lot of things happening, so definitely continue to visit the website at wcaps.org. We are going to be having a separate website for all of our podcasts. So we're going to put them on something separate and really developing the work that we're doing in a podcast. So thanks again for listening. And this is Bonnie Jenkins signing off.
Thank you for tuning in. To keep up to date with all things WCAPS, visit us at wcaps.org or join us at an event in a city near you. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at WCAPSnet. Until next time, speak up, speak out, get engaged.